Alright, ladies and gentlemen, for our first presentation of the year, we're going to take a look at the process of science, or something that you more regularly refer to as the scientific method. Okay? Now you can see when you look at this wordle over here that there's a lot of different things that go into the scientific method. Okay? What you have to understand is when we're talking about the scientific method or the process of science, what we're really getting at is a way of knowing that is trustworthy. And that's a big deal when it comes to things like peer review. Part of the reason we trust science is because other scientists redo experiments. That's why we care a lot about data and how it's done well. That's why we care a lot about evidence, and also why we care a lot about the practice. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Is we're not necessarily going to go through a step-by-step sequence, but rather what we're going to do is talk about the process and the practice and how this way of knowing can become so trustworthy. So the first thing we want to do is look at some key ideas here. All right. So a hypothesis is a testable statement based on observation and existing data. And the key thing here is testable. A hypothesis is testable. If you can't test it, it's not useful. Now, a lot of key ideas in science that we use to further our understanding of the universe are actually just things we go by hypothesis. Now, I know you frequently have heard the term educated guess when it comes to hypothesis, and that's true, because an educated guess is a guess that's based on observation and existing data. Now, experimentation is a really key concept when it comes to science. All right, experimentation is actually how we test hypotheses. When you think about experiments, and I mentioned this in class a couple times while we were discussing vocabulary, all experiments are comparisons. We'll talk about that a little further on in the presentation, but it's important to realize that an experiment is always a comparison. Next up here on our list is data. Data is evidence that is collected and supports or refutes a hypothesis. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it. Like, data is collected in very specific ways. There are ways that we can take a look at data to actually do some math to it and try to be like, oh, well, that data is useful, or oh, that data doesn't really tell us what we think it does. All right, but it's very important that you understand is data is evidence. Now, there's multiple types of data, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in this presentation. But for right now, it's evidence. All right. A theory is something that can be thought about in a lot of ways. But what I really want to focus on is the idea that a theory is first and foremost a scientific truth. That word is frequently used in a multitude of ways. And in science, a theory is truth. Now, theories tend to explain a broad set of events or ideas. You know, like the cell theory explains cells. Well, cells are really complicated. There's a lot of detailed hypotheses within that theory that explain the specifics of cells. But the theory, the cell theory itself, explains a lot about cells. We also have a law. Laws tend to be simple statements. Frequently, they are mathematical equations. And those equations will, or those simple statements will say something that is pretty much always observed as truth. I think sometimes it's a misconception that law is better than theory. It's not. Theory tends to explain really big, broad, hugely complicated things. Laws tend to be what we use to explain very simple concepts that are everywhere. Like law of gravity. Gravity affects everything. I mean, frequently there are lots of adaptations in your body that affect gravity. The way the planets move is affected by gravity. The way water moves is affected by gravity. But gravity itself is a very simple thing with a very simple mathematical explanation. And that's what laws tend to be. All right. So let's get into a little bit of detail here. So you'll notice on this slide I have two key ideas. I have experiments and data. So let's talk about experiments. We mentioned earlier that experiments are comparisons. Okay, experiments are comparisons. So the control in an experiment is sort of your untouched sample. So if I wanted to know if eating peanut butter would make people stronger, my control group would be people that don't eat peanut butter. If I wanted to know if eating bread made people gain weight, people who don't eat bread are my control. Your control is your untouched sample. It is a group in an experiment where nothing is done to them. Your experimental group is where you manipulate a variable. Now, this is important. A variable. You can never manipulate more than one variable in an experiment. Sometimes we call this the independent variable. You know, there's actually a couple other names we can reference it as. What I want you to understand is that in an experiment, we manipulate a variable because we want to see how our group, our sample, is different than the control. And see, that's the whole thing. We are comparing. What are we comparing? The thing we changed with the thing we did not. All right, and that's the key idea with experiments. Experiments are a big deal. You know, that's actually where scientists get to be creative, trying to figure out how you test something, try to figure out how you manipulate just one variable. That's a really interesting and underrepresented part of science, and that's something that we're really going to try and work with more this year. Okay. Now, next up, what we have over here is data. Now, I mentioned earlier that data can be manipulated in certain ways so that we can decide, oh, well, this data is telling me something important. This data is not telling me something important. And data also can be collected in a number of ways. Sometimes data can just be observations. Other times data can be the results of experiments. Sometimes data can be measurements. Sometimes data could just be things you count. Data can take a lot of forms. But whatever form that data takes, we always put it into one of two categories. There is qualitative and there is quantitative. Qualitative data is descriptive. The chimpanzee had brown hair. That chimpanzee has black hair. All right, those are sort of qualitative descriptions. Frequently, this type of data does fall under that idea of observations. All right. Now, qualitative data is important and it's useful. Without it, there's a lot of things we just wouldn't understand about the universe, particularly when it comes to some more macro things like animal relationships and animal behaviors. But on the other side of the equation, we have quantitative data. And that means that there's numbers. So if you look right here, where it says quant, that actually comes from the word quantity. That's how I always remember that quantitative data is numbers. Quantitative data is numbers. Sometimes it's a measurement. How many centimeters did the plant grow? How many milliliters of liquid do I now have? How many milliliters of liquid did I lose? How many chimpanzees are colored red? How many chimpanzees are colored brown? How many times did the big chimpanzee beat up the little one? Quantitative data is always numbers, all right? And the reason we care about this is you can't argue about numbers. Now, please don't misunderstand. We can argue about what the numbers mean, all right? But if there's 5 chimpanzees with brown hair, or if I lost 5 milliliters of liquid, it's 5. 5 is 5. We can argue about why, what it means, should we run the experiment again? That's where discussion in science comes into play. But the number itself is an absolute. That's why we like to use it, okay? Now, next up here, I want to talk a little bit about a common misconception that happens when we're doing science. And this ties in with our discussion about data, but this is a really important thing. Frequently we make observations, okay? And observations are detailed accounts of facts. Okay? That's the kind of thing that leads us to hypotheses. That's the kind of thing that provides us data. An inference is an attempt to discover what data might mean. For instance, an observation. There are 3 black chimpanzees out of 10. An inference? There must be some disadvantage to having black fur. One of those 2 things, there are 3 chimpanzees that have black fur, is simply a detailed account of a fact. The other one, black fur must be some sort of disadvantage, is an inference. I'm attempting to discover what that data, what those facts, what those observations mean. Okay? Inference versus observation is a key idea. When you're doing observations, you're you're only concerned with facts, with what is something. When you're dealing with an inference, you're concerned with what a fact might let us know. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is the interrelationship, or almost the cycle of science. All right? Frequently, people make observations. Now, keep in mind, observations can sometimes be simply reading other people's research so that they know what's already been discovered. And those observations lead them to a hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is testable. So then that hypothesis, all right, leads them to say, hey, let me make an experiment. That experiment gives them data. Now, this data could support the hypothesis, or the data could not support the hypothesis. Either way, the experiment is never a waste. If I learn the hypothesis is wrong, it was a good experiment. If I now have evidence to support the hypothesis, it's a good experiment, because either way, I have learned something I didn't know. So then, maybe, depending on the data, I do a different experiment, and then I collect more data that then supports my hypothesis again. And then say I do a different experiment, and I collect more data that supports my hypothesis. And then somebody else is looking at my data, and they have another hypothesis, not different than mine, but about the same topic. And they perform experiments. And then the cycle continues. People have hypotheses, they collect data that supports their hypothesis, or it refutes it, and then more people get hypotheses, and eventually all these hypotheses lead to theories. And then theories can allow us to develop new hypotheses. All right, so those are the basics, the basic facts of the scientific method. All right.